Hey, welcome everyone to 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die. Thank you for continuing to go with us on this journey. My name is Matt, and who do I have with me here today? Of course,
Dan the Movie Man.
Dan, the movie man. How are you, sir?
Doing pretty good. How are you today, Mr. Matt?
I am good, hanging in there. Can't complain. Dan, we got an interesting one. We've been going down this road of 1001 movies. We never know what we're going to get. Um, we kind of started off in the early 1900s, and then we've kind of been hanging out in like the 50s, the 70s. Now we're in the 80s. Um, I don't know, how do you feel on this journey so far that we've been taking?
I mean, it's definitely been interesting. We've bounced all over the place, and I've got to say, a lot of the films that we have watched have really captured the soul of the era that they're coming from. And I'm not really sure if this one's going to be any different. I mean, we got Spicoli in the background here, if you guys are familiar with him, traditional surfer guy. But how about you, Matt?
I'm having lots of fun, and of course, if you haven't been tuning in with us, and this is your first episode watching, we are going off of the 1001 movies you must see before you die book, 2021 edition by Stephen J. Schneider, updated by Ian Hayden Smith. It is available, of course, on Amazon and probably other wherever you get your books from. Um, we're here to talk about Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Uh, so we're not going to waste any time. We're going to jump right in. Fast Times at Ridgemont High is from 1982. If you're following with us in the book, it was page 671. It is directed by Amy Heckerling, and the film features, or follows rather, a group of high school students growing up in Southern California based on real life adventures chronicled by Cameron Crowe. Stacey Hamilton and Mark Radner are looking for a love interest and are helped along by their old classmates Linda Barrett and Mike Damone, respectively. The center of the film is held by Jeff Spicoli, a perpetually stoned surfer dude who faces off with the resolute Mr. Hand, who is convinced that everyone is on dope. That's my first time reading that description, and I gotta say, I love it. It describes the movie perfectly. Um, This, of course, was starring Sean Penn as Jeff Spicoli, Jennifer Jason Leigh, Judge Reinhold, Walston, a number of other actors who would go on to be quite famous. Um, Dan, I'm going to kick it off to you. We're introducing a new segment here, which, if you've been with us for a long time, then it's not new. You might remember we used to go over some stats of the movie. So, Dan, what do we got for stats on Fast Times at Ridgemont High?
Well, a lot of what we consider to be part of a success of a movie is how much it brings in. And the backstory to this kind of interesting as well. So, the box office on its opening weekend, the film earned $2.5 million. Originally, the studio wasn't sure how this was going to perform, so they had a limited opening. But upon the initial success that it had, the budget wasn't too crazy there. They ended up releasing it to 713 theaters, earning 325 million. At the time, the film ranked 29th among the U.S. releases, which ultimately earned it $27.1 million, six times its $4.5 million budget. So later, this gained popularity and had television and home video releases. It was one of those things that the studio at one point had considered to shelve. I found that kind of interesting. They said that it would fall in line with a lot of the movies that were teen or high school movies. It was when Porky's and some other films were coming out. And one fun fact I thought about this, Mr. Matt, was that the film was initially given an X rating as it had a scene in it that featured full frontal nudity. And for those of the male full frontal nudity, which typically in that time period was reserved just for female full frontal nudity, wasn't a lot of male full frontal nudity. That was eventually taken out of the film and shortened,
Do
even
we
though.
know who or where or what scene?
So it was in the pool house. If we remember when Stacy was with, what was his name? Um, shoot, having a little bit of a mind part
It's
there, but
okay.
the gentleman that didn't really, it wasn't really a fulfilling experience, let's put it that way. But initially, that was a full frontal nudity scene, and the director had it in it to portray kind of the awkwardness that teen sex would lead up to. And ultimately, when it was going to be released with the X rating, they felt that it wouldn't be as wide a release as it would have been otherwise. So that was cut down and shortened, which got it down to an R rating. So it'd be more accepted by the studio.
I see. See, I did not know that. I knew that I knew a lot of what you said, but I did not know that.
Yep. So I believe, let me see if I can find the name here for us. Anyways, we'll come back to me on that.
Okay. Um,
Mike
yeah,
Damone.
well, no.
I'm sorry, Mike. Woo!
Yes, Mike. Okay. Okay. So Dan, this was your first time watching this, right?
It really was, yes.
This was my second time. Um, I remember my first time watching this, and um, and it wasn't that long ago. It was in 2023 that I watched this, so it wasn't an insanely long ago. And I watched it during a well, we'll get into that in a minute, but uh, I gotta say, I don't know about you, but the first time I watched this, I didn't know what I was expecting, what to expect, but I don't know if this was it. Obviously, this is one of those classic 80s films, classic teen high school movies that you hear about. Um, but I guess I just maybe was expecting, maybe I'd been spoiled. I don't know if spoiled's the right word, but if maybe I've just been used to John Hughes, like Breakfast Club, Weird Science, that kind of thing. And I wasn't really prepared for how R-rated this thing was. um, so, uh, Dan, what are your initial thoughts? What did you think of Fast Times at Ridgemont High? Just initial reaction.
So the first, I would say, 30 minutes of this, I thought it was going to be something completely different than what it turned out to be. And that being said, I thought it was just going to be another dumb teenage movie, and it had the 80s vibe. I mean, we're in the era where malls are just starting to get into their main thing. A lot of teenagers would flock there um, just to do something around these areas. And you're introduced to these two polar different characters. Spicoli, obviously, who later down the road or even to today's time is still quoted. And if you think about a traditional surfer guy, I mean, this is it. It's got it all over it. And then on the flip side of it, we have Miss Stacy, who is kind of discovering herself at 16 years old, coming into her own and exploring herself in a way that I don't think many movies had done up to this point, like examining sex and growing up through the eyes of a young woman, and just face it so head on as it did with themes like abortion and the male part of this. It gave an interesting contrast, and I want to elaborate on it, but I don't want to get into too much before we give your initial thoughts on it. But I think overall, it definitely still resonates today. Just that awkwardness, that way that folks handle themselves. I feel like it was a very real representation of what someone that age would have gone through at that time.
Sure. No, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I apologize for the sleeping dog in the back. I tried to blur the background, but it just wasn't working. Um, so yeah, no, going into this, like I said, second time, but first time in a few months. So I'd kind of forgotten some things, but remembered most of it. Um, how just how great is Sean Penn? I think he nails that character. When you think Sean Penn, you don't think Jeff Spicoli, typically, right? I mean, yeah, I don't. Um, you think this dramatic actor, you think this accomplished actor, but I mean, this just shows the range, if nothing else. But it's an early film. Um, I watched this the first time doing a Nicolas Cage binge, which I don't know. I was going to ask if you happen to notice, Dan, but Nicolas Cage shows up very briefly in this movie.
Yep, and not only that, he doesn't show up as Nicolas Cage. He films up as
Right.
Nicholas Coppola, which is his name before he changed it to the screen name Nicolas Cage, which I thought was pretty cool. And this is his first time on screen, correct?
Yes, yes, it is. And he's only 17 years old. That's one thing, just throw another stat at you. He actually lied about his age to get the part. The director, of course, later discovered that he wasn't 18, but he was 17 years old at the time. So super young Nicolas Cage, not even legal Nicolas Cage in this movie here. One of the first things I took away was that the soundtrack in this movie is fantastic. This had a great soundtrack. I was jamming the entire time. Like, I want to get like either the record of this, or I'm sure, I don't know if it's on, I haven't looked to see if it's on like Apple Music, but down to download it. Like, I think it's just a great 80s soundtrack, 80s vibe. Um, I think the movie perfectly captures the essence of school life in the 1980s. And I mean, there's a reason for that. It was not only was it made in the 1980s, but that's where it's set. And I think it just does such a good job of capturing that vibe. Um, and then there's a lot of things I liked, which I'll go back into here in a minute. But between the cast members and the characters, I think this movie goes a lot deeper, and you kind of hinted at that. Um, but it goes a lot deeper than other high school movies of the time. So those are just kind of some of my initial thoughts.
Unmute myself there. I think Kayla definitely agreed with you. She's the more musically inclined out of the two of us, and all those songs are definitely straight bangers on the soundtrack. So completely in agreement there. And not only Nicholas Coppola making an appearance, but a lot of appearances like um, Mr. Forrest Whitaker. I know this was one of the early ones
Yes,
in his career. There's a few other folks that showed up as well, which,
Eric
uh,
Stoltz. Eric
yep,
Stoltz. I don't know if who's like, you blink and you miss him. Forrest Whitaker also blink and you miss him. No different than Nicolas Cage, but yeah, the cast in this is crazy.
it's definitely a springboard for a lot of these folks. And again, coming back to Spicoli and Stacy's stories. So at first, I didn't really understand why we were looking at these two characters, and then I started to feel like we're looking at two different perspectives. We have a carefree person that, he's stoned every time we see him. He's ordering pizza to his classes. He doesn't care about school really. He's more interested in the functions and having fun, living in the moment, catching the big waves. And by the end of it, he turns into a hero and stops a robbery and all this other fun stuff, which is one of my favorite parts of the film. So it's very lighthearted in that sense. And then through Stacy's perspective, is a 16-year-old who ends up having intercourse with the gentleman who's way older than her in the beginning, with an older friend that's giving her advice on what to do when she gets into those situations. Um, but then again, we introduce Mike into the picture, and I think that's kind of where this changes its tone, and it felt where the movie was taking a different turn. And of course, in that, it serves as a warning for unprotected sex and unwanted pregnancies, but also how males and females experience this differently. Where when Stacy approaches Mike and says, "Hey, I'm pregnant and I've decided to get an abortion. All I want from you is, if you could pay half of it and give me a ride." And at first he agrees. And ultimately he ditches her. He doesn't show up to even give her a lift or explain, hey, I didn't have enough money. Honestly, just walked out of the situation entirely because he didn't have to face the consequences of it. Whereas she went to the clinic, she ended up convincing her brother to go bowling, I believe, and she went across, and then he starts singing. That's another great performance there with Brad and someone who I thought was completely superficial in the beginning of the movie, but he catches on what's happening as he sees her going into the building. He waits for her, gives her the lift, um, and she comes out, and it's done. And you have to think in 1982, abortion was illegal all of 11 years in the United States, period. And it wasn't a moral dilemma. It wasn't something that we're attacking a character on. It wasn't like, Juno, who's being put through the ringer by all these folks, like, what should she do? That was never a question. Like, it was her choice from the beginning. And I think that one of the things that stood out after the fact is we had, I believe, a female director on this, and that was part of the input, you know, where this was coming from. And ultimately, between the two, again, just such a wide difference between Spicoli and what he dealt with, Stacy what she dealt with, and ultimately how their stories progress. And ultimately, Mike does have some consequences, which he's got, some choice words spray painted on his car and his locker at school. But ultimately, did he ever have to own up to what he did and just walking out of that situation? I don't know, but I feel like there is definitely a statement to be said there. And I think for that, this movie, deserves a stand there. So, but back to you on that topic, Mr. Matt.
Yeah. No, I agree. The movie goes places that those John Hughes movies that I was mentioning earlier doesn't go, and that's, I think, what kind of throws me, because I think you said you didn't know it was a totally different type of movie than what you thought it was going to be in the first couple minutes, because I think we as a culture are accustomed to one thing when it comes to 80s teen high school movies, and this is that, but it's also not that. It is dealing with the serious matters like abortion. It does have, and another thing that I noted, adult characters, while not as well sculpted, are treated more so with humanity and warmth than just the adults in the background of the other high school movies. Um, there's you get a little bit of drama, you get lots of comedy, you get a whole lot of sex in this. That's why I even texted you, which I guess by the time I texted you, you had already even watched it. But I texted you, like, if you hadn't seen this yet, maybe don't watch it with the children, because I had even forgotten, just in the few months that it had been, I had forgotten just how R-rated this thing was. But I think when you were talking about, like, did Mike pay for those consequences? Maybe not. I think that also just and not that it's excusing it by any means, but I think this whole movie is a nostalgic view of a bygone era. I mean, nowadays that wouldn't happen, or wouldn't be allowed to happen. So I think for its time, I think you got to put it into context. And again, should have Mike done better? Yes, absolutely. But maybe that's not, there's lots of reasons why that choice might not have been made. Again, just an observation from me about maybe the time period that it takes place in. But this movie is really, there's no real plot. There's no real linear plot. It's like a series of vignettes, and it works. It works for me. Like the description said, Spicoli kind of keeps everything connected. But otherwise, if you think about it, there's no like one plot through the whole movie. It's just multiple little plots. And a few things that I commented or that I wrote down: Jennifer Jason Leigh, Brian Backer, Robert Romanus, of course, Sean Penn, all phenomenal. I really loved Ray Walston, who at the time was best known for My Favorite Martian. And he plays Mr. Hand in this. And I loved the back and forth with him and Spicoli. And I don't know if you're aware, but Ray Walston had very much become typecast before this movie, and this movie actually helped him not be typecast. So they like people would shout at him down the street, "Hey, Mr. Hand," and that actually he was actually happy that he was now being recognized for something else. Uh, Overall, no shoes, no shirt, no dice. One of my favorite lines in the movie. It's just everything that you think of when you think about 80s teen movies, I think, is in this movie. That's kind of where I'm at right now.
And I know we've already passed the stats or interesting trivia part of this, but this was based on a story that was written last name Crow. The gentleman had gone undercover, I believe he was 21 at the time, at an actual school, pretending to be a student there. And I guess got a lot of his inspiration for the stories, what was, going on with teenagers' lives. And again, I just want to say through that lens, yes, on the start of the movie, I feel like it was put through the lens of like, okay, nostalgia, 80s, da 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 da, but more real to the point as we get further in the movie, just from the perspective of teenagers. And really, even to this day, I know you said in this day and time, still stand out. And the real life consequences of actions that, still happen. I think these things still happen today. And just how it carries over and is kind of a timeless piece. And yeah, ultimately it puts some rose colored tint to it, which maybe is not always the case and needed to be, but um, on every level, I feel like the actors did a tremendous job portraying these folks, even at the ages they were at the time. Um, just bringing this to the screen and really being something that was able to be presented. But I know at this point, typically in our film, we usually give our rating. Do we think this is a movie that is one to see before you die? So I think I went first last time, Matt. I don't know if you want to give your idea this time.
Sure. Yes. Yes. This is a movie you must see before you die. Um, I'd almost argue that if you were to collect a bunch of 80s teen movies, and like these are the essential ones, you could eliminate most of those. But I would keep maybe The Breakfast Club, and I would keep Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Maybe one or two others, but I think it's right up there. It's the staple of this genre. And it set a tone for movies to come. I mean, we're comparing it to, like I keep saying, Breakfast Club and things like that. That came after this. This was early 80s. So this kind of set a tone and a marker for things to follow in its footsteps.
And we think about the title Fast Times at Ridgemont High. What was the meaning behind that? And it was for that time period, well, life goes too fast for teenagers, I think was the thought process there. And it's something that we hear even today, that life just moves so fast, and kids are getting exposed to more and more and more as life goes on. And really, it's interesting when you take the camera and you point it back in time, and we're going through the same things that generations of people have gone through. And so when it comes down to, is this a movie that you should see before you die? Again, absolutely. I think this is definitely one you should watch before you die, just because, again, the human element doesn't change. And that's one thing that I find interesting about this film is you could watch it in the 80s, you could watch it in the 90s, the thousands, the tens, the 20s, and onward, probably for decades and decades. And I still feel that you're going to have that relevance. And maybe we don't have the malls that we used to have, or we have, all the music and the cars that we did, but ultimately take this story, put it in today's setting, boom, it still holds. So
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely.
I agree. That would be interesting to see this same movie done. And I'm not like pushing for a remake by any means, but like it'd be interesting to see a new version of this in 2024. Like, what would that look like? I think you could do it. I think you could, like you said, I think it fits a lot of the same stories and tropes at all. It could all work exactly the same. Um, that's it for this one, guys. As always, thank you for tuning in. Our new subscribers, thank you for subscribing. We appreciate you. If you don't already, make sure you subscribe, click the notification bell so you don't miss an episode. We're dropping these on Fridays, but we are talking if once we get to a certain point, because little peek behind the curtain, Dan and I are actually recording well ahead of time. So yeah, so once we get to a certain point, we may start releasing multiple in 1 week. So make sure you click that bell so you don't ever miss an episode. We drew last time and we got page 671, which gave us Fast Times at Ridgemont High, but it also had another movie on the same page, which will be the next movie we talk about. So we're not going to do a random drawing this time. We'll be doing that on the next episode. Dan, we mentioned it at the end of the Willy Wonka episode, but just in case, what is our next movie?
Well, guys, I guess we're talking about a movie from the same year, right? Turns
Yeah.
out that it's The Evil Dead.
Ooh.
And guys, the one thing before we get into this next episode, this is an independent film. So, out of these, how many have we done that have been independent films?
Evil. You talking about Evil Dead being an independent film?
Yes, sir.
Aside from maybe A Trip to the Moon, I don't know if that was independent.
No,
I don't know that.
I would say that's about as independent as you can get, but
Right.
definitely going to be something interesting. So, will it be or hold up to the studio movies that we've seen, like the Ten Commandments, and even this? Is it
Yeah.
going to stand that test? And I guess you'll have to tune in the next episode to find out.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be kind to one another, love one another, and we will catch you on the next one.
See you guys.